The skull fragment lay buried for over 500 years before Dr. Alina Reeves first held it in her gloved hands. What she saw through her magnifying glass that cold October morning would unravel one of history's most enduring mysteries, and expose a royal conspiracy so shocking it had been covered up by 3 successive monarchies. The fragment belonged to Richard III, the last Plantagenet King of England, found beneath a Leicester car park in 2012. But this wasn't just another royal burial discovery. Hidden within the microscopic fracture patterns on Richard's skull was forensic evidence of a murder so brutal, so calculated, that it would rewrite everything we thought we knew about one of history's most controversial monarchs. Modern forensic archaeology has just solved a 500-year-old cold case, and the truth is more horrifying than anything Shakespeare ever imagined. This isn't just the story of how a king died, it's the story of how cutting-edge science exposed a royal cover-up that shaped the course of English history. If you're fascinated by how modern forensics can unlock ancient mysteries, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the evidence we're about to reveal will shock you to your core. The discovery that started everything. Philippa Langley had been searching for Richard III's grave for over a decade when she finally convinced Leicester City Council to excavate a municipal car park. Historical records suggested that the last Plantagenet king had been hastily buried somewhere in the ruins of Greyfriars Friary. But centuries of urban development had obscured the exact location. On August 25, 2012, the excavation team's mechanical digger struck something hard about 3 feet below the asphalt. What they uncovered was a roughly constructed grave containing a complete skeleton with severe spinal curvature, scoliosis, that matched contemporary descriptions of Richard III's physical deformity. But it was what they found on the skull that changed everything. The moment I saw those trauma marks, I knew we weren't looking at a death in battle, says Dr. Sarah Hainsworth, a forensic archaeologist who specializes in medieval warfare injuries. These weren't the random wounds you'd expect from combat. They were precise, methodical, and designed to cause maximum psychological impact, as much as physical damage. The skull showed evidence of at least 11 separate impact wounds, inflicted with different weapons and from multiple angles. But more disturbing was the pattern of injuries. They had been delivered in a specific sequence, with mathematical precision that suggested ritualistic execution rather than battlefield casualties. Radiocarbon dating confirmed that the remains dated to the late 15th century, consistent with Richard III's death at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. DNA analysis, comparing the skeleton to known descendants of Richard's sister, confirmed the identity beyond doubt. But the forensic evidence suggested that the official story of Richard's death, killed in glorious battle, defending his crown, was a complete fabrication. The forensic evidence was about to reveal that one of England's most famous monarchs had been the victim of the most calculated royal assassination in British history. The wounds that tell a story. Hainsworth's team used high-resolution CT scanning, microscopic analysis, and experimental archaeology to reconstruct exactly how Richard III died. What they discovered was a methodical execution that had been deliberately disguised as a battlefield death. When we analyzed the trauma patterns, we found evidence of at least 4 different weapon types. Dr. Hainsworth explains: a halberd, a sword, a dagger, and what appears to have been a rondel, a specialized assassination weapon. This wasn't random violence. Someone had planned this execution down to the smallest detail. The largest wound was a massive gash across the back of the skull, consistent with a halberd blow delivered from above, while Richard was on his knees, or lying face down. But this wasn't the killing blow. Forensic analysis showed that Richard was still alive when it was inflicted, as evidenced by the bleeding patterns preserved in the bone tissue. More revealing were the smaller wounds around the skull's base. These had been made with surgical precision, using a rondel, a narrow needle-like dagger, specifically designed for penetrating armor gaps and delivering fatal wounds without external bleeding. The angles of penetration showed that these wounds had been inflicted while Richard was restrained, unable to defend himself. The sequence of wounds tells a story of systematic torture, says Dr. Hen. Richard was first disabled with the halberd blow, then subjected to multiple precision wounds designed to cause maximum pain, while keeping him conscious. The fatal wounds came last, and they were delivered by someone with intimate knowledge of human anatomy. But perhaps most disturbing was what the forensic team discovered about the post-mortem wounds. Several injuries had been inflicted after Richard was already dead, including deliberate disfigurement of his face and hands. This wasn't just murder, it was a deliberate attempt to humiliate and dehumanize the dead king. The bone analysis revealed traces of specific minerals that could only have come from weapons forged in particular regions of England. By analyzing the metallurgical signatures, researchers were able to trace the murder weapons to specific armories, and, ultimately, to the households of Richard's assassins. The forensic evidence was painting a picture of premeditated murder involving multiple conspirators, but who would have had both the motive and the means to orchestrate such an elaborate assassination? The Leicester car park secrets. The excavation site itself held crucial clues that had been overlooked for centuries. Dr. Matthew Morris, the site director for the Richard III excavation, discovered that the hastily dug grave contained evidence of a cover-up that extended far beyond simply hiding a body. The burial wasn't just quick, it was panicked, Dr. Morris explains. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that Richard's body would never be found or properly examined. The grave was deliberately placed in an area that would be built over within months, and the body had been positioned to obscure the most telling trauma wounds. Soil analysis around the grave revealed traces of quicklime, a substance used to accelerate decomposition and eliminate evidence. But the conspirators had made a crucial mistake. They had used too much quicklime, which actually preserved rather than destroyed the bone evidence. The chemical composition of the soil provided a detailed timeline of when the burial took place and how many people had been involved in the cover-up. Archaeological evidence showed that at least 6 different individuals had participated in the burial. Footprint analysis in the preserved soil layers revealed boot sizes and wear patterns that could be matched to specific social classes and occupations. The gravediggers weren't common soldiers. They were skilled craftsmen and possibly members of the nobility. But the most shocking discovery came from isotope analysis of materials found in the grave fill. Dr. Jane Evans, an isotope geologist, discovered that some of the soil used to fill Richard's grave had been transported from locations over 100 miles away, specifically from estates belonging to Richard's supposed allies. This level of planning and coordination suggests a conspiracy that went to the very heart of the medieval English establishment. Dr. Evans explains. People who should have been loyal to Richard were actively participating in covering up his murder. Ground-penetrating radar revealed that the original Greyfriars Friary had been systematically demolished within months of Richard's burial, with the ruins deliberately scattered to prevent future excavation. Someone with considerable political power had wanted to ensure that Richard's grave would never be found. The conspiracy unfolds to understand who killed Richard III and why. Dr. Reeves's team turned to a combination of historical detective work and forensic genealogy. By analyzing DNA samples from the remains and comparing them to genetic profiles of medieval noble families, they were able to identify potential suspects with unprecedented precision. The investigation revealed that Richard's murder had been orchestrated by a shadowy coalition of nobles who had been planning his assassination for months before the Battle of Bosworth Field. These weren't Tudor loyalists acting on behalf of Henry VII. They were Richard's own supporters who had turned against him for reasons that had been hidden from history. The genetic evidence shows that at least 3 of Richard's closest advisors were present when he was killed, says Dr. Michael Ibsen, a genealogist who is himself a direct descendant of Richard III. These were men who had eaten at his table, who had sworn oaths of loyalty, who had been trusted with the kingdom's most sensitive secrets. The breakthrough came when researchers analyzed microscopic DNA traces found on Richard's armor fragments. Using advanced genetic sequencing techniques, they were able to identify genetic markers from multiple individuals who had been in close physical contact with the king at the time of his death. One of the most significant DNA matches was to the Brackenbury family line, specifically to Sir Robert Brackenbury, who had been Richard's most trusted friend and the Constable of the Tower of London. Historical records show that Brackenbury was supposed to have died fighting loyally beside Richard at Bosworth, but the forensic evidence suggests he was actually one of Richard's assassins. The betrayal went deeper than anyone had imagined. Richard III had been murdered by his own inner circle, men he had trusted with his life and his kingdom. Further genetic analysis revealed connections to the Howard family, the Lovells, and even the Percys, all supposedly loyal Yorkist nobles, who had publicly supported Richard's claim to the throne. The forensic evidence showed that these families had been secretly coordinating Richard's assassination, while maintaining the facade of loyalty. The murder weapons. Hainsworth's team used experimental archaeology to recreate the exact weapons that had been used to kill Richard III. By analyzing the wound patterns and metallurgical traces, they were able to determine not just the types of weapons used, but their specific dimensions, weight, and even the fighting techniques employed by the assassins. We created exact replicas of medieval weapons and tested them on ballistic gelatin models to understand the force and angles required to create Richard's specific wound patterns. Dr. Hainsworth explains. What we discovered was that his killers were highly skilled warriors who knew exactly how to disable and torture their victim. The primary weapon was a warhammer with a specially modified spike, a weapon that appears in no known medieval armory catalogs, but matches perfectly with the massive skull fracture that had disabled Richard. Metallurgical analysis showed that this weapon had been custom forged, specifically for the assassination, using techniques that were closely guarded. Secrets of particular smithing guilds. The rondel dagger used for the precision wounds contained traces of a specific steel alloy that could be traced to a single forge in Yorkshire, a forge that supplied weapons exclusively to the household of Lord Thomas Stanley. This was particularly significant because Stanley was supposed to have remained neutral during the Battle of Bosworth. But the forensic evidence proved he was an active participant in Richard's murder. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of what researchers termed the humiliation weapons, specialized tools used to inflict the post-mortem injuries. These included a curved blade designed specifically for facial disfigurement and a specialized for damaging the hands and fingers. The psychological impact of these wounds would have been immediately apparent to anyone who viewed Richard's body. The killers wanted everyone to know that Richard had died dishonorably, says Dr. Hainsworth. The post-mortem wounds were a form of medieval character assassination. They were designed to destroy Richard's reputation even in death. The level of planning and coordination revealed by the weapon analysis was staggering. But the motive for such an elaborate assassination was even more shocking. The hidden motive, the reason why Richard III's closest allies turned against him, had been one of history's greatest mysteries. But new documentary evidence, discovered in recently opened private archives, has revealed the shocking truth. Dr. John Ashdown Hill, a medieval historian who specializes in the Wars of the Roses, uncovered a cache of encrypted letters that explained the conspiracy's true motivation. What we found wasn't political opposition to Richard's rule, Dr. Ashdown Hill explains. It was something far more personal and far more dangerous to the conspirators' own survival. Richard had discovered evidence of systematic embezzlement and treason among his own nobles, and he was planning mass executions. The letters, written in a complex cipher that took modern cryptographers months to decode, revealed that Richard's inner circle had been systematically looting the royal treasury for years. More damaging still, several of his most trusted advisors had been secretly negotiating with foreign powers, planning to sell English military secrets and territorial claims in exchange for personal wealth and estates. Abroad, Richard had apparently uncovered this conspiracy in the weeks before Bosworth and was planning to expose the traitors publicly before having them executed for high treason. The nobles realized that their only chance of survival was to eliminate Richard before he could act against them. The assassination wasn't about putting Henry Tudor on the throne, says Dr. Ashdown Hill. Henry was just a convenient excuse. The real purpose was to eliminate the one person who could expose and punish the conspirators' crimes. The letters also revealed the extent of the cover-up that followed Richard's death. The conspirators had not only orchestrated the king's murder, but had spent months afterward systematically destroying evidence of their own crimes. They had forged documents, eliminated witnesses, and even arranged the accidental deaths of several individuals who knew too much about their activities. Most significantly, the letters showed that the conspirators had been actively working to shape Richard's historical reputation, ensuring that he would be remembered as a tyrant and child killer rather than as the victim of their betrayal. The negative portrayal of Richard III, that persisted for over 500 years, was actually the result of a deliberate disinformation campaign designed to justify his murder. The scientific revolution, the Richard III investigation, represented a watershed moment in forensic archaeology, demonstrating how cutting-edge scientific techniques could solve historical mysteries that had baffled scholars for centuries. The interdisciplinary approach pioneered by Dr. Reeves's team has since been applied to dozens of other historical cold cases. Dr. Caroline Wilkinson, a facial reconstruction specialist, used the skull remains to create the most accurate likeness of Richard III ever produced. The reconstruction revealed a face that bore no resemblance to the villainous caricature popularized by Shakespeare and Tudor propaganda. Instead, Richard appeared as a thoughtful, somewhat scholarly young man whose physical deformity was far less pronounced than historical accounts suggested. The facial reconstruction showed us a human being rather than a monster, Dr. Wilkinson explains. When you see Richard's actual face, it becomes impossible to believe the propaganda stories about him. This was clearly someone who had been systematically demonized to justify his murder. The isotope analysis techniques developed for the Richard III project have revolutionized our understanding of medieval population movements and social structures. By analyzing the chemical signatures in bone and tooth enamel, researchers can now trace individuals' movements throughout their lives with unprecedented precision. Perhaps most importantly, the investigation established new protocols for handling politically sensitive historical discoveries. The Richard III Society worked closely with the University of Leicester to ensure that the research remained academically rigorous while respecting the cultural and historical significance of the findings. The technological breakthroughs achieved during this investigation have opened up entirely new possibilities for solving historical mysteries, but they've also raised troubling questions about other official historical narratives. The cover-up unravels as news of the forensic discoveries spread. Historians began re-examining other aspects of the Wars of the Roses with fresh perspectives. Dr. Michael Jones, author of several definitive works on the period, discovered that the Richard III murder conspiracy had been just one part of a much larger pattern of noble corruption and betrayal. Once we knew what to look for, the evidence was everywhere, Dr. Jones explains. The same families involved in Richard's assassination had been systematically undermining royal authority for decades. They had turned treason into a profitable business model. Archival research revealed that the conspirators had continued their activities well into the Tudor period, gradually accumulating power and influence, while eliminating anyone who threatened to expose their crimes. Several mysterious deaths among early Tudor courtiers now appeared to be assassinations designed to protect the secret of Richard's murder. The investigation also revealed how the conspirators had manipulated historical records to support their version of events. They had commissioned biased historical accounts, destroyed inconvenient documents, and even arranged for forged evidence to be discovered in strategic locations. Most significantly, researchers discovered that the conspirators had infiltrated the early Tudor court, ensuring that their version of Richard's death became official historical fact. Henry VII, despite being Richard's successor and supposedly benefiting from his death, had actually been largely ignorant of the true circumstances surrounding the assassination. Henry Tudor wasn't the mastermind behind Richard's murder, says Dr. Jones. He was just a convenient figurehead who allowed the real conspirators to remain hidden, while taking credit for removing a tyrant from the throne. The international connections, the conspiracy against Richard III, had international dimensions that extended far beyond English politics. Dr. Anne Curry, a specialist in medieval European diplomacy, discovered evidence that foreign powers had been actively supporting and financing the plot against the English king. French diplomatic archives, recently digitized and made available to researchers, contained references to payments made to English nobles in the months before Richard's death. These payments were ostensibly for future considerations, but were actually funding the assassination conspiracy. The French court saw Richard as a significant military threat, Dr. Curry explains. He was planning major campaigns to reclaim English territories in France, and his murder eliminated that threat more effectively than any military victory could have achieved. Venetian merchant records showed that several of Richard's assassins had been receiving regular payments through Italian banking houses connected to French intelligence networks. The financial trail revealed a sophisticated international conspiracy that had been years in the making. Cliff's Spanish archives contained encrypted diplomatic correspondence that referenced the English solution, apparently a codename for the assassination plot. The Spanish court had been concerned about Richard's potential alliance with other European powers and had supported the conspiracy as a way of maintaining the balance of power. The scope of the international conspiracy was breathtaking. Richard III had been the victim of what amounted to a medieval international intelligence operation. The psychological profile of Helen Castor, a medieval historian who specializes in royal psychology, worked with modern criminal profilers to create psychological profiles of Richard's assassins. The analysis revealed disturbing insights into the medieval mindset and the motivations that drove the conspiracy. What we're looking at is a group of individuals who had completely rationalized betrayal and murder as legitimate political tools. Dr. Castor explains, they weren't psychopaths in the modern sense, but they had developed a moral framework that allowed them to justify any action in pursuit of their goals. The psychological analysis revealed that the conspiracy's leader was likely Sir William Stanley, brother of Thomas Stanley, and a man with a documented history of switching sides for personal advantage. Stanley had developed what modern psychology would recognize as narcissistic personality traits, combined with an exceptional ability to manipulate others. The other conspirators appeared to have been recruited through a combination of financial incentives, blackmail, and appeals to their existing grievances against royal authority. Several had legitimate complaints about Richard's policies, which made them susceptible to recruitment by the conspiracy's organizers. Most disturbing was the psychological profile of the actual assassins, the individuals who had physically carried out Richard's murder. These appeared to be professional killers who had been recruited specifically for their ability to perform extreme violence without emotional involvement. The forensic evidence suggests that Richard's killers were experienced in assassination techniques, says Dr. Castor. This wasn't their first royal murder, and it probably wouldn't have been their last if they hadn't been exposed by modern forensic science. The modern investigation detective inspector Kevin Hyland of Scotland Yard's Historical Cases Review unit became involved in the Richard III investigation when researchers discovered that some of the forensic evidence might be relevant to modern criminal cases. Working with medieval historians, Hyland applied contemporary investigative techniques to the 500-year-old murder case. From a modern police perspective, this was a textbook conspiracy case. Hyland explains, "You had multiple suspects with clear motives, extensive planning, professional execution, and a sophisticated cover-up. The only difference was that it happened 5 centuries ago." Using modern criminal profiling techniques, Hyland's team was able to reconstruct the likely sequence of events leading up to Richard's assassination. The conspiracy had probably been in planning for at least 6 months, with the assassins conducting reconnaissance and practicing their attack methods. The murder itself had been timed to coincide with the Battle of Bosworth, allowing the conspirators to disguise their assassination as a battlefield casualty. They had positioned themselves strategically during the battle to isolate Richard from his loyal supporters and create the opportunity for their attack. The level of coordination required for this operation suggests military-level planning and execution, says Hyland. These weren't amateur plotters. They were experienced in covert operations and had probably carried out similar assassinations before. The modern investigation also revealed how the conspirators had eliminated potential witnesses and evidence in the aftermath of the murder. Several individuals who might have been able to expose the truth had died under suspicious circumstances. In the months following Richard's death, the parallels between this medieval assassination and modern conspiracy cases were uncanny, but the implications for our understanding of medieval politics were revolutionary. The rewriting of history, the forensic evidence from Richard III's murder, has forced historians to completely reassess the standard narrative of the Wars of the Roses. Dr. Michael Hicks, one of the world's leading experts on the period, admits that many accepted historical facts about Richard's reign and death need to be reconsidered. "We've been teaching and writing about a version of events that was essentially Tudor propaganda designed to cover up a political assassination," Dr. Hicks explains. The real Richard III was nothing like the monster portrayed in historical accounts. He was a competent ruler who was murdered by his own supporters for discovering their corruption. The revelation has implications that extend far beyond medieval English history. If the official account of Richard III's death was fabricated, how many other historical narratives might be equally unreliable? Historians are now applying forensic, archaeological techniques to other controversial historical events, with potentially explosive results. Universities across Europe are establishing new programs that combine traditional historical research with cutting-edge forensic science. The Richard III investigation has demonstrated that physical evidence can sometimes provide more reliable information than documentary sources, especially when those sources were created by individuals with clear political motivations. The Shakespeare industry has been particularly affected by the revelations. Tourist sites associated with Richard III are being forced to revise their presentations, and several major theatrical productions have been cancelled or modified to reflect the new historical understanding. We can't continue to perpetuate historical myths when we have clear forensic evidence contradicting them, says Dr. Hicks. Richard III deserves to have his real story told, not the propaganda version created by his murderers. The legal implications, the forensic evidence proving that Richard III was murdered rather than killed in battle, has raised fascinating questions about the legal status of his death and the legitimacy of subsequent monarchs. Professor Mark Hill, QC, an expert in constitutional law, has been studying the implications of the discovery. If Richard III was unlawfully killed, then technically his death was not a legitimate transfer of power, Professor Hill explains. This raises complex questions about the legal basis for Tudor rule and everything that followed from it. The murder also calls into question the validity of various legal and political decisions made by Henry VII's government, particularly those involving the confiscation of properties belonging to Richard's supporters. If Henry's claim to the throne was based on a fabricated version of events, then some of these property transfers might be legally questionable. More practically, the discovery has implications for modern inheritance law and property rights. Several noble families have used their Tudor-era grants as the basis for contemporary legal claims. But these grants might be invalid if they were based on fraudulent historical accounts. The Richard III Society has been exploring the possibility of seeking some form of legal recognition for the true circumstances of the king's death. While this wouldn't change modern political arrangements, it might provide a formal acknowledgement that Richard was the victim of murder rather than a casualty of legitimate warfare.